I always knew the HOA in my neighborhood was a bunch of self-important busybodies, with too much free time and not enough real authority. But I never thought they'd be dumb enough to try and arrest me in my own backyard. It all started on a quiet Saturday morning. I was enjoying my coffee, watching the sun rise over my fence, when I noticed something odd in the reflection of my kitchen window. A group of 4 people stood on my sidewalk, all wearing matching polo shirts, sunglasses, and an air of authority that looked as genuine as a $3 bill. One held a notebook, another had a cheap walkie-talkie strapped to her hip, and front and center, arms crossed like she was about to hand down a life sentence, stood Debra Simmons, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA. Now, Debra had always been a thorn in my side. She'd harassed me about my fence, my truck, even the color of my damn mailbox. But this was new. I took a deep breath, took the last sip of my coffee, and went to answer the door. The second I turned the knob, Debra launched into her speech like she was leading a press conference. "Mr. Walker, you are in serious violation of HOA regulations, and we are here to take action." I stared at her, waiting for the punchline. Was this some kind of prank? Before I could speak, she pulled out a laminated card and shoved it in my face. "You are under investigation for multiple infractions, including an unregistered vehicle on your property, unauthorized landscaping modifications, and," she paused dramatically, "behavior unbecoming of a community resident." I almost laughed out loud. My truck was perfectly legal, my yard hadn't changed in years, and as for unbecoming behavior? That was HOA speak, for I don't attend their pointless meetings. But then she said something that turned this from a joke into something far more serious. "Because you have failed to comply with previous warnings, the HOA is exercising its right to civil custody. We are here to detain you until this matter is resolved." I blinked. They wanted to arrest me. Debra puffed out her chest, like she was expecting a medal for bravery. Her 3 cronies nodded like trained parrots. What they didn't know, I'm the town marshal. A real one. With a real badge, a real gun, and a whole lot of patience for this kind of nonsense. I decided to play along. "Interesting," I said, rubbing my chin. "And how exactly do you plan to arrest me?" Debra snapped her fingers. One of her goons, a sweaty guy squeezed into a too small t-shirt, stepped forward and proudly produced a pair of plastic handcuffs. It was official. The circus was in town. I took a deep breath, stepped back, and in one swift motion, pulled out my wallet, flipping it open to reveal my badge. Debra's smug smile disappeared faster than a Black Friday deal. "Good to know you think you have arresting powers," I said, my voice calm but firm. "Because right now, you're committing multiple crimes, including impersonating law enforcement and attempted kidnapping." Silence. Debra's eyes widened. Her minions looked at each other, suddenly realizing they were playing with fire. I crossed my arms. "You have 5 seconds to get off my property before I arrest you for real." Sweat dripped down the forehead of the guy with the plastic cuffs. Debra's hand trembled slightly. Then, like cockroaches scattering when the lights come on, they backed away, mumbling excuses. "This isn't over," Debra snapped before storming off with her pathetic squad. I watched them go, shaking my head in disbelief. What the hell had just happened? One thing was for sure: this was far from over. I thought that after the absolute embarrassment Debra and her goons suffered on my doorstep, they'd slink away and find something else to obsess over. I was wrong. See, most people, when faced with public humiliation, take the loss and move on. But not Debra. Oh no, she wasn't the type to back down, she was the type to double down. And that's exactly what she did. The first strike came the very next morning. I went outside, coffee in hand, ready to take out the trash. But as I stepped onto my driveway, I noticed something strange. My garbage cans were gone. Not tipped over, not moved a few feet, completely gone. I looked around. No sign of them anywhere. Then, across the street, standing with her arms crossed like she was overseeing a military operation, was Debra. The second she saw me notice her, she smirked. It wasn't just a smirk, it was the smug, satisfied grin of someone who thought they had just played a brilliant move. I exhaled slowly and took another sip of my coffee. Fine. If this was the game she wanted to play, I'd let her play it. But she wasn't done. When I got to my mailbox, I found an envelope with the HOA's official stamp. Great. I opened it, already knowing it was going to be ridiculous. And, of course, it didn't disappoint. The letter contained a list of new penalties for my so-called violations of community standards. Among them, I was no longer allowed to use waste disposal services. I was banned from parking my truck in my own driveway. I had to attend a mandatory behavioral meeting with the HOA board. I read it twice just to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. Then, without a second thought, I tore the paper in half and let the pieces flutter to the ground. If Debra wanted to get under my skin, she was going to have to try harder than that. And she did. That afternoon, I went out to run some errands. When I came back, I noticed something sitting right in the middle of my driveway. An orange traffic cone. Next to it, a plastic sign taped to a wooden stake declared, "Notice, this garage is closed by order of the HOA." I blinked. I stood there for a solid 5 seconds, just processing the sheer audacity of this woman. Debra had closed my garage. I walked over, ripped the sign off, and tossed the cone onto the sidewalk. Across the street, 2 of her lackeys were watching, one of them holding a notebook, furiously scribbling. I could just imagine what they were writing. Owner removed cone improperly. Resident failing to comply with unauthorized HOA orders. Possible threat to community peace. It was absolute nonsense. I turned back toward my house. But before I could even step inside, I heard a very familiar, very annoying voice. "You can't remove that." I slowly turned around. There she was, marching toward me like a small-town dictator, laminated HOA handbook clutched in her fist like it was the Constitution. "Oh, can't I?" I asked, holding the cone like it was some kind of murder weapon. "In my own driveway?" She pointed a perfectly manicured finger at the sign I had just crumpled. "That is an HOA sanction. You can't just ignore community rules." I took a deep breath, fighting the urge to laugh in her face. "Debra, you don't have the authority to close my garage." I took a step closer, lowering my voice just enough. "In fact, you don't have the authority to do anything except annoy me." She widened her eyes, clearly scandalized by my lack of respect for her supreme rule. But before she could launch into another speech, I turned around and slammed my door shut. I knew this wasn't the end of it. Debra wasn't going to stop. She was just getting started. And the worst part, she was about to get even dirtier. I should have known Debra wouldn't stop at stealing my garbage cans or slapping ridiculous sanctions on my garage. No, that would have been too easy, too petty. She needed something bigger, something that would make my life hell. So she did what any power-hungry, delusional HOA tyrant would do. She called the cops on me. It happened the next afternoon. I was at the police station, going over paperwork from a case, when my phone rang. It was Todd Jackson, one of the few sane neighbors in the community. He sounded uneasy. "Ethan, man. You might want to get home. The cops are at your house." I paused. "Cops?" "Yeah. 2 patrol cars. Debra's out there too, talking to them." I exhaled through my nose. Of course. I grabbed my keys and left immediately. The whole drive home, I was already putting the pieces together. If Debra had managed to drag actual law enforcement into this mess, then she'd spun a hell of a story. When I pulled onto my street, there they were, 2 patrol cars parked in front of my house. 2 uniformed officers stood on my lawn, while Debra stood a few feet away, hands clasped together, her expression a perfect mask of concerned citizen. As I got out of my car, one of the officers turned and immediately recognized me. "Oh, boss." See, this was a small town. I knew almost every cop on the force. And judging by their faces, they already knew this was a colossal waste of time. I shut my car door, walked up to them, and crossed my arms. "Let me guess. You got a call about a dangerous man in the neighborhood?" The officer shifted uncomfortably. We received a report of suspicious activity. The caller said there was a man on this property with a firearm, behaving aggressively." I turned my head to look directly at Debra. "And let me guess again. That caller was this lady right here?" Debra's eyes widened, and she gasped like I had just accused her of witchcraft. "I only reported what I heard. Some residents were concerned. I had no choice but to notify the authorities." I turned back to the officer, resisting the urge to roll my eyes. "All right, well, let's clear this up. Do you see a firearm?" The officer glanced at my hip where my service pistol should have been, if I had been carrying. But I wasn't. My holster was empty. Nope, he admitted. Do I look like I'm behaving aggressively? No. I gestured at my house. Would you like to search the property? Check for this dangerous situation. The officer sighed. Look, Ethan, we know this is BS. But since we got the call, we have to at least write up a report. He then turned to Debra. And ma'am, just so you're aware, making false police reports is a crime. For the first time, I saw a flicker of real fear in Debra's eyes. She had assumed the cops would blindly take her side. That they'd throw me in cuffs, or at least make my life miserable. Instead, she was being warned. She opened her mouth to protest, then thought better of it. Her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her face red with frustration. The officers wrapped up their report, gave me an apologetic nod, and left. And then it was just me and Debra. We stared at each other in silence for a long moment. I could see the gears turning in her head. She was fuming. This wasn't how things were supposed to go for her. She had expected me to lose. Instead, she had just humiliated herself again. Finally, she turned on her heel and stormed back to her house. But not before throwing over her shoulder, "This isn't over." I smirked. Oh, I knew that. Because Debra? She wasn't just persistent. She was desperate. And desperate people? They get reckless. I should have known that after the police stunt backfired, Debra wouldn't just lick her wounds and move on. No, that woman had the persistence of a mosquito in the summer, annoying, relentless, and damn near impossible to get rid of. If calling the cops on me hadn't worked, she was going to try something bigger, something messier. And she did. The very next morning, I woke up to the sound of a heavy truck pulling up right in front of my house. Groggy, I got out of bed, peeked through my window, and what I saw made me pause mid-yawn. A full crew of construction workers was stepping out of their vehicle, hauling equipment, jackhammers, shovels, bright orange cones. They looked like they were about to start a major project. I grabbed a shirt, threw it on, and stepped outside just in time to see the foreman walking up my driveway, clipboard in hand. "Morning, sir. We're here to begin the excavation." I raised an eyebrow. "Excavation?" He glanced down at his notes. "Yes, we received an urgent work order from the HOA. There's been a report of a severe underground pipe leak beneath this property." I exhaled slowly. Of course, of course. I glanced across the street, and there she was, Debra Simmons, standing on her porch, arms crossed, watching with that same smug, satisfied smirk she always had when she thought she'd won. She thought she had me cornered. That I'd have no choice but to let these guys tear up my yard and turn my home into a disaster zone. I turned back to the foreman. "Who authorized this work?" He flipped a few pages, then read aloud. "Signed by Debra Simmons, president of the HOA." I nodded slowly. "Right. And do you have a permit from the county?" The guy hesitated. I smirked. "Yeah, I didn't think so. See, HOA boards like Debra's love to act like they ran a military dictatorship. But there was one little problem: they weren't actually the law. They couldn't just order construction projects on private property without the owner's consent. And as it turned out, I hadn't given mine. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts. Within a few seconds, I had the county building inspector on the line. "Hey, Mark. Quick question: any permits approved for emergency construction at my address?" I already knew the answer before he even spoke. No. Why?" I grinned. "Because there's a crew here right now, claiming they've been ordered by the HOA to dig up my yard for emergency repairs." There was a long pause on the other end. Then Mark sighed. "Yeah, that's illegal. Give me a sec." While I waited, I turned back to the foreman. "Hate to break it to you, but you've been sent on a wild goose chase. This whole job is unauthorized." The guy's face fell. He muttered a curse under his breath, before turning back to his crew. "All right, pack it up." Just then, my phone rang again. It was Mark. "They try to argue, call the sheriff. That HOA has no power over private utilities." I laughed. "Already handled." Across the street, Debra's smirk had disappeared. She was now marching toward me like a runaway train, face red with fury. "You can't just shut this down," she barked. I raised an eyebrow. "Shut what down?" The illegal construction you ordered on property you don't own? Her hands clenched into fists. This is about the safety of the community. If your property has a leak, it could affect all of us. I stepped forward just enough to make her pause. Lowered my voice just enough to make her nervous. You and I both know there's no leak, Debra. You just wanted to cause damage. She flinched but quickly masked it with another one of her holier-than-thou expressions. You're being unreasonable, she huffed, before storming off back to her house. I watched her go, shaking my head. Debra had tried to have my house dug up. She had wasted time, money, and resources all because I refused to bow to her made-up authority. This wasn't over. She was losing, and she knew it. And when people like her start losing, that's when they get desperate. If there was one thing I knew for sure, it was that Debra Simmons didn't know how to quit. Most people, after having their fake police force exposed, their attempt to get me arrested fail, and their illegal construction scam shut down, would have realized they'd lost. They would have packed up their laminated HOA handbook and moved on. But Debra? No. She wasn't just determined, she was obsessed. And now, she was going for the nuclear option. It started with a letter. I found it in my mailbox one morning, sealed in an official-looking HOA envelope, stamped with urgent, disciplinary action required. I already knew it was going to be ridiculous, but I opened it anyway. It read, Dear Mr. Walker, after multiple severe violations of HOA regulations and continued defiance of community leadership, it has been determined that your presence in this neighborhood is disruptive to the well-being of all residents. As such, the HOA board has initiated a formal disciplinary review, in which your continued residency will be evaluated. A hearing is scheduled for this Friday at 7:00 p.m. in the community hall. Failure to attend will be considered an admission of guilt. Sincerely, Debra Simmons, HOA President. I stared at the letter for a moment, then I laughed. Out loud. This woman had officially lost her damn mind. She thought she could kick me out of my own home? She thought this was some sort of medieval kingdom, where she could just declare me a heretic and banish me. I folded the letter, tucked it into my pocket, and went inside. Because if Debra wanted to have a trial, I was going to make sure it was one she'd never forget. The HOA trial Friday night rolled around, and I made sure to arrive right on time. The community hall was packed. The entire neighborhood had shown up, sitting in rows of folding chairs, whispering amongst themselves like they were waiting for a courtroom drama to unfold. Up front, at a long table, sat Debra and the HOA board members, her loyal inner circle, each one looking like they took this way too seriously. Debra had a stack of papers in front of her, and a smug expression that made my fingers itch. The second I walked in, the murmuring got louder. Debra cleared her throat and tapped her pen against the table. Mr. Walker, she began in that fake professional tone she loved so much. We are gathered here to address your numerous violations against this community. I folded my arms. Oh? And what violations would those be? She straightened her papers dramatically. For starters, you have repeatedly ignored HOA regulations, openly mocked the authority of this board, and engaged in behavior that is unbecoming of a community member. I raised an eyebrow. Unbecoming? What is this, a country club? The audience chuckled. Debra's jaw tightened. Additionally, she continued, you have shown hostility toward community leaders, refused to attend mandatory meetings, and obstructed essential HOA operations. You mean the essential operations where you tried to have my property illegally demolished? More chuckles. Debra's face turned red. I leaned forward. Cut to the chase, Debra. You want me gone, don't you? She tried to maintain her composure, but I could see the anger bubbling just beneath the surface. Considering your complete disregard for this community's standards, we believe it would be in everyone's best interest if you vacated the premises. I let that hang in the air for a moment. Then, I laughed again. And tell me, Debra, how exactly do you plan to make that happen? She blinked. You don't own my house, I said, making sure everyone in the room heard me. You don't control my mortgage. You have no legal power to evict anyone. A few people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. Some of them, I realized, were just now figuring that out. Debra scrambled for a response. The HOA has the right to enforce community harmony. No, you don't, I interrupted. This isn't a gated community. The HOA here is voluntary. You don't have the legal authority to remove a resident. You never did. Silence. People were exchanging looks now. Debra's own loyal followers were realizing she had been bluffing the entire time. Her eyes darted around the room as if searching for support. But it wasn't there. For the first time, she looked nervous. I leaned back in my chair. Face it, Debra. You lost. Her hands curled into fists on the table. She looked ready to scream. But instead, she did what she always did when backed into a corner. She doubled down. This isn't over, she spat. You might have won this round, but I assure you, Mr. Walker, this is far from over. I stood up. Oh, I know. Because Debra wasn't just desperate anymore, she was running out of time. And when people like her start running out of time, that's when they make their biggest mistake. Debra had officially lost control. The trial stunt had backfired. The whole neighborhood had witnessed her attempt to evict me from my own home, only to find out that she had no real power to do so. The illusion of her authority was cracking, and she knew it. But instead of backing down like any sane person would, she did what power-hungry control freaks do best: she went nuclear. And this time, she wasn't just playing dirty. She was playing with fire. The last desperate move a week after the HOA trial. I woke up to the sound of sirens. I groggily got out of bed, pulled back the curtain, and immediately felt my stomach tighten. 2 county enforcement vehicles were parked outside my house. 2 inspectors, both carrying notepads, were standing at the end of my driveway. And standing across the street, pretending to just be an innocent bystander, was Debra Simmons. I exhaled slowly. Here we go. I grabbed my coffee, threw on some jeans, and stepped outside, acting like I wasn't the least bit surprised to find government inspectors on my lawn. Morning, gentlemen, I greeted. What can I do for you? One of them, a middle-aged guy with a clipboard, adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. Sir, we've received a complaint regarding multiple serious structural violations on this property. I blinked. Excuse me? He flipped through his notes. According to the report, this residence has unauthorized construction, illegal plumbing modifications, and possible pest infestation. I let out a slow whistle. That's quite a list. The younger inspector next to him added, we're going to need to conduct a full inspection. I crossed my arms. And who, exactly, made this complaint? The older guy hesitated for just a second before answering. The HOA. Of course. I glanced across the street. Debra was watching. She wasn't smirking this time. She was waiting. Waiting for me to panic. Waiting for me to explode. Waiting for me to fight back so she could finally say, see? I told you he's a problem. But that wasn't going to happen. Because unlike Debra, I wasn't an idiot. I sighed dramatically, took a sip of my coffee, then stepped aside. All right, gentlemen, go ahead, inspect away. The inspectors exchanged glances. They had clearly expected me to argue. But I wasn't worried because I knew my house was up to code. And 2 hours later, they did too. The final blow after a full inspection, checking my plumbing, my wiring, my foundation, my attic, and every other possible violation Debra had made up. The lead inspector walked up to me, looking almost embarrassed. Sir, we found no issues. Everything on this property is compliant with county regulations. I smiled. So, just to clarify, the complaint was completely false? The inspector sighed. Yeah, pretty much. I turned my head slowly toward Debra, who was still standing there, watching with wide eyes. And then I said it loud enough for everyone in the street to hear, great. Because I'll be filing a formal complaint against the HOA for harassment and misuse of public resources. Debra's face went pale. You're overreacting, she tried, stepping forward. It was just a safety precaution. I cut her off. No, it was an abuse of power. I looked back at the inspectors. And that's illegal, isn't it? The younger inspector nodded. Debra's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. She tried to argue, but it didn't matter anymore. I had just turned the tables for the last time. The investigation over the next few days. The county launched an official investigation into the HOA. And when the floodgates opened, the skeletons started pouring out. Debra had been fining residents without justification to raise money for community projects that never actually happened. She had hired contractors to do maintenance, only to overcharge the HOA and pocket the difference. She had skipped the annual re-election process entirely, meaning she wasn't even legally supposed to be the HOA president anymore. The deeper they dug, the worse it got. And finally, the HOA board had no choice. They called an emergency meeting. And this time, it wasn't to try and kick me out. It was to kick Debra out. The final meeting, the community hall was packed. Debra sat at the front, red-faced and sweating bullets. When the board announced the findings of the investigation, there was no trial, no debate, no long-winded speech. The decision was unanimous. Debra Simmons was officially removed as HOA president. She tried to fight it. She threatened to sue. She claimed innocence. She screamed about conspiracy. But no one listened. And then, the police walked in. Because as it turned out, embezzling tens of thousands of dollars from an HOA, that's a felony. As the officers placed real handcuffs on her wrists, someone in the back of the room clapped. And then another. And then the whole room erupted in cheers. Debra was dragged out the door, screaming about how this wasn't over. But it was. It was finally over. The moment Debra Simmons was hauled out of the community hall in real handcuffs, the room erupted. Some people cheered. Others whispered in disbelief. A few of her die-hard followers sat in stunned silence, finally realizing their so-called leader had been a fraud all along. And me? I just stood there, arms crossed, watching the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA get dragged away like a common criminal. Because that's exactly what she was. The aftermath the next few days were chaos. Without Debra at the helm, the HOA crumbled faster than a wet paper bag. It turned out that she had been the only one truly enforcing all the insane rules and ridiculous fines. The rest of the board? They were either clueless, complicit, or too scared to speak up. But now that she was gone, nobody wanted to keep the HOA alive. A special meeting was called, this time by residents who actually cared about the community, not about power trips or bogus rules. And the result? A vote to dissolve the HOA entirely. I wasn't even surprised. After years of Debra's nonsense, nobody had any faith in the organization anymore. The homeowners who once blindly followed her now saw the truth. They had been manipulated, forced to pay unfair fines, and threatened with rules that didn't even legally exist. Once the financial fraud was confirmed, tens of thousands of dollars missing, that was the final straw. The HOA was officially abolished. Just like that, the nightmare was over. No more fines. No more fake police forces. No more dictatorship. And, best of all, no more Debra. What happened to Debra? Turns out, stealing money from an HOA isn't just unethical, it's a crime. The county pressed charges: felony fraud, embezzlement, and misuse of funds. And because she had been running the HOA like her own personal bank account, there was no way to wiggle out of it. She lawyered up, of course, claimed it was all a misunderstanding, tried to blame the board members. But the evidence was rock solid. Bank records, fake invoices, HOA money used for vacations, fancy dinners, and business expenses that just so happened to be at luxury spas. Her own signature was on every shady transaction. She had dug her own grave. Her trial didn't last long. She was found guilty on multiple counts and sentenced to several years behind bars. And the best part? She had to sell her house to pay restitution. That's right. The same neighborhood she tried to control? She had to leave it forever. Rumor had it she moved to another state, trying to start fresh where nobody knew her name. Good. Let her try. She was someone else's problem now. Peace returns. The months after Debra's downfall were strangely peaceful. No more passive-aggressive HOA notices. No more Karen types patrolling the sidewalks. No more bulls, just neighbors finally living their lives. One of my neighbors, Todd, came by a few weeks after everything settled. "Man, I still can't believe it's over," he said, shaking his head. "She really had us all fooled." I shrugged. "She just counted on nobody standing up to her." He grinned. "Good thing we had you, huh?" I chuckled. "Damn right." And with that, life went back to normal. Well, mostly. Every now and then, when I saw an HOA horror story on the news, I'd wonder if Debra had landed in another neighborhood, trying to rebuild her little empire. But if she did, I had a feeling she wouldn't last long. People like her, they always get caught in the end. And as for me, I finally got to enjoy my home without a dictator breathing down my neck. And I have to say, freedom has never felt better. The story of Ethan Walker and the corrupt HOA isn't just entertaining, it carries a powerful lesson about standing up to abuse of power. Too often, people in positions of authority, whether in a community, a workplace, or even within families, take advantage of others simply because they believe no one will challenge them. They create rules that serve themselves, manipulate those around them, and expect blind obedience. But as Ethan's story shows, bullies only have power if we let them. Debra built her rule on intimidation and deceit. She counted on fear, on people not asking questions, on neighbors accepting unfair treatment just to avoid trouble. But the moment someone stood up to her, the illusion fell apart. This applies to any aspect of life. If someone is mistreating you, if a system is unfair, if a person in charge is abusing their role, speak up. Know your rights, trust your instincts, and don't let fear silence you. Because the truth is, people like Debra always lose in the end. And those who stand their ground? They walk away stronger, freer, and victorious. Ethan's story is a testament to the power of resilience, courage, and standing up against corruption. It reminds us that no one is above the law, and that tyranny, no matter how small, can be defeated when people refuse to be silenced. If this story resonated with you, leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more tales of justice, perseverance, and triumph.